Our second presenter is Ana Sarmiento, who is a recent graduate of Brandeis University, currently working as a cancer genetic counselor for Rocky Mountain Cancer Centers in Colorado. She's a first-generation Latinx American with an interest in providing services in Spanish.
Hi, everybody. There's a lot of you out there, so if my voice starts wobbling, you guys know why. Okay. So I'm Anna, or Anna, either one, and today I'll be presenting on a topic that's very personal to me. The title of my presentation is Genetic Counseling Training Program and Missions Teams and Racial and Ethnic Diversity, Surveying the Gatekeepers. Okay, it looks like it's on the timer. So it's not news to the people sitting here that the genetic counseling profession struggles with issues of diversity. So since genetic counseling training programs are the only body that independently selects, trains, and graduates genetic counselors, I was interested in learning their views and beliefs regarding the diversification of our field. So to explore this, I had a few preliminary questions. What are the current demographics in genetic counseling? How do they compare to the general population? An even more basic question, why do we care? Why do we make it such a big deal? And thirdly, who's in charge? Who do we look to for leadership on this issue? I compiled this chart using recent data from the Census and Department of Labor Statistics, as well as the 2018 NSGC PSS survey. The general population is about 60% white, and all related healthcare professions are consistently above 60%. Genetic counselors aren't the only ones that are struggling with issues of representation, but if you compare across the professions, genetic counselors are at the bottom of the list, and not just because I put them there. This is a graph that I created using PSS data from the past 27 years. I actually did not include a series for whites because when I did, it skewed the graph such that you couldn't appreciate these trends, but their membership fluctuated between 90 and 96%. Neither blacks and African Americans nor Latinos have surpassed 2% representations respectively. Native Americans have never surpassed a full percent, staying steady at 0.2%. The Asian population has met and exceeded their general population representation, but this statistic really needs to be taken with a grain of salt, considering that there's lots of different types of Asian subgroups, in addition to the fact that if you're the only Asian in your class or the only Asian at your job, it's a very isolating experience. So why do we care about diversity? What are the benefits of a diverse workforce? So the changing demographics of the United States makes it more and more likely that genetic counselors are going to render services to somebody that has a different racial or ethnic background from themselves. So it makes the notion of cultural humility, some people know it as cultural competency, very important and something that you can't teach through a textbook. It can also improve minority access to quality care. Minorities tend to be in areas with shortages of providers, making it difficult to access services. Additionally, there's research to suggest that provider-patient interactions are more successful and more satisfying for patients when there's racial or ethnic concordance. Workforce diversity can also help broaden the research agenda. There's limited research regarding health problems and disproportionately affect minority populations. Also, people tend to research what they like, so if you're not a minority, you're probably not going to be researching minority-related issues. It also increases the chance that some of these professionals will rise to management and policy-making roles, which can lead to more lasting change. Okay, so how, right? We've established that, We've established that minorities are not, oh my goodness. Just pause it. Okay, whatever. So three major players came up: training programs, NSGC, and all genetic counselors. So training programs were the stakeholder that most often were called upon to implement strategies or changes in efforts to improve diversity within genetic counseling. Some of the cited suggestions were creating a position that's called the Chief Diversity Officer. So this person, their job is to oversee, develop, and implement and evaluate all diversity-related efforts. Also increasing diversity among the faculty, placing less emphasis on GPA, GRE, other standardized measures of competence, to increase awareness. And this is a huge umbrella, so it encompasses a lot of things like visiting schools, K through 12, creating written materials, brochures, providing outreach education, and specifically implementing targeted recruitment strategies. The suggestions for the NSGC were short. Basically, create an open access webpage, so don't make us get a registration fee, and team up with training programs. And then invariably, in every single paper, there was some line or some sentiment expressing that all genetic counselors bear some degree of responsibility in helping ameliorate the diversity gap. So this led to my research questions. Programs are the most often called upon to make changes. So do they feel that they bear the responsibility in the diversity of the field? And if not, who do they think should be responsible? Since it seems that programs are in the spotlight, what do they think about diversity? No one's ever really asked them. Is diversity on programs' radars? What are they doing about diversity? Are they following any of the recommendations that I found in the literature? And lastly, I was curious about the culture of genetic counseling programs, because I think as a whole we've all kind of heard people say, we care about diversity, but do they care about diversity as much as, say, their academic reputation or their curriculum or research and dissemination? So I was curious about that. I created a survey through Qualtrics to explore my research questions. The survey was divided into 5 sections. The first was demographics. I asked about length of time in admissions, role in the program, and if they identified as a minority in genetic counseling to protect anonymity. I did not ask which programs they represented or their geographical location. Most of the literature remarked on the diversity gap in genetic counseling, but there was one paper from 2011 that claimed that genetic counselors in some ways were ahead in diversity. So I was curious about how aware program directors were of genetic counseling demographics. I wanted to know what programs physically do to increase diversity and if they follow any of the recommendations in the literature. I was also interested in programs' perceptions of certain strategies to increase diversity and what their opinions were on barriers to diversity. Lastly, to explore that question about how much programs care about diversity, I conducted a sweep last November. There were 46 training program websites that I could look at. I went into their mission statements, their About Me pages, and I was looking for indicators of program values with the intention of discerning which of these factors were most important to programs, and 9 values emerged, so I asked my participants to rank them from most to least important. Ultimately, there were 49 questions. The project was IRB exempt through Brandeis, and the survey was open for about 10 weeks. The survey link was disseminated through the Association of Genetic Counseling Program Directors, or the AGCPD listserv, and at that time there were 148 members. The recipients were instructed to share the link with relevant admissions members, and those people would be those that were participating in the 2019 match cycle by either reviewing applications, conducting interviews, providing input for ranking, and or finalizing those ranks. So 82 surveys were analyzed. 9 out of those 82 were self-reported as minority. I did not ask how. I further separated them into years of admission and program role. And the greatest proportion of my sample had up to 4 years experience in admission. So most of these reported just months on the job. Sorry, my slides are on a timer, so. All right, so participants were asked the extent to which they agreed with these statements. So compared to other healthcare professions, genetic counselors are ahead in diversity. Racial and ethnic minorities are well represented in the genetic counseling profession. Racial and ethnic minorities are well represented in the healthcare workforce. Almost all disagreed with the first 2 statements, but they were a little more divided on the third. When it came to assessing which strategies programs felt were the most valuable, 3 came out on top. Increasing diversity in the applicant pool, increasing awareness of the profession. Again, this is through those site visits, written materials, etc. And the last one is providing financial aid or financial assistance. Similarly with barriers, we were interested in which barriers programs felt were the most detrimental, and 3 came out on top, were financial considerations, access to quality prep, and lack of minority presence in the faculty. When asked who was the most responsible for diversifying the profession, training programs, NSGC, and all genetic counselors were chosen the most often. So this is the question that asked them to rank the 9 values, and you can see that diversity and inclusion was ranked 6th out of 9, with curriculum and academic reputation as the top 2 values. And this one's interesting. During my literature review, I actually found a paper that evaluated a medical school's perception on whether they did a good job in recruiting minority students. And the participants in that study felt that they did perform well, but then the data that was curated from the conclusion of that study actually challenged that perspective. So this led me to wonder how GC programs reported their diversification activity and if they felt they performed well with respects to these efforts. Almost all respondents agreed that their program is involved in some kind of diversification effort, and over half reported performing well at these efforts. So I had a lot of findings, so for the discussion I'm just going to pull the most compelling ones. This statement, compared to other healthcare professions, genetic counselors are ahead in diversity, was actually found in a 2011 paper in the Journal of Genetic Counseling. It was a special issue towards diversity. And I wanted to know the extent to which current genetic counselors agreed with it. So almost everyone acknowledged that the GC field is not sufficiently diverse. However, over half respondents, okay, this is really annoying. Over half the respondents perceived that their program performed well with respect to diversification efforts. So it's interesting that these two views are being held together for a majority of the participants. It would be interesting to learn why or how that is. So another interesting comparison was how respondents viewed the importance of diversity. So 100% of respondents recognize the importance of diversity, but when you look at how it's ranked 6th on average. So one idea that we had about how we can raise its position on the list, programs could consider developing strategies devoted to infusing diversity and inclusion factors into curriculum and into student development. So this has two benefits. It raises the visibility of diversity and inclusion as a part of that program's identity, and as a result, might probably attract more diverse prospective students. One of the most interesting findings was with strategies and barriers, specifically that financial aid, awards, or scholarships, essentially financial factors came up as the #1 barrier and also as one of the top 3 strategies. Okay, let's see. It's not working now. Oh, there it goes. Yay! Okay, great. Thanks for not leaving. Considering the emphasis on financial considerations, I went back into the literature to see if it was similarly emphasized there. It turns out that financial recommendations are really only made about 3% of the time in the literature. And when I say the literature, I mean the past 27 years of literature. So while the largest category recommendations were related to increasing awareness, and again, those were the things I mentioned earlier, written materials, site visits, et cetera. So this over-focus on financial considerations is a critical issue because it allows a couple of things. #1, and I would be remiss for not saying this, it does allow the support of a long-held bias that when it comes to recruiting minorities, the strongest association for success in that area is the implementation of financial support. So in other words, minorities are poor, right? It also tricks us into believing that since we don't have money, we can't recruit minorities. So it's like pushing the issue away from us. It's not in our hands. So what if we shifted gears to low-cost, high-impact strategies? What if, for example, prospective applicants can increase the visibility of the genetic counseling profession with an educational outreach project, like at a school, at a clinic, at a grocery store, who knows? This has 2 benefits. #1, educational outreach might be a more attainable experience than other relevant experiences such as job shadowing, which, by the way, it took me 3 years of cold calling to get 1 shadowing experience. Simultaneously, this could increase the visibility of that specific program and of the genetic counseling profession. Another view that was really interesting was the extent of agreement to this statement. In order to meet parity in recruitment to genetic counseling graduate programs, so in other words, in order to be diverse, we will need to lower admissions standards. 84% of my participants agreed that, or felt that in order to meet parity in recruitment, lowering standards was necessary. So we need to be careful with this, right? Because data on admission standards was not collected. So we don't know if they mean lower the academic aptitude, or maybe they mean like relax the volunteer experiences, or so there was some issues with how the question was worded, but again, the response to this question might be uncovering additional implicit biases that minority students are unable to meet rigorous admission standards. Alternatively, this question might also be partly explained by the fact that almost 80% of respondents were in agreement that qualities other than academic performance were important when regarding a student's potential to succeed in genetic counseling. So despite the spotlight on a few stakeholders, no one has explicitly taken on the express goal to focus on diversity issues. As early as 1993, Smith et al. Stated a joint effort between the NSGC and genetic counseling training program directors could be made to advance the recruitment of minorities. Nearly 30 years later, we're seeing the exact same sentiment being illustrated by this survey. Recently, the NSGC has included a diversity and inclusion as part of their 2019-2021 strategic plan, and has initiated the formation of a diversity and inclusion task force. A lot of the action items in the strategic plan are identical to those that are included in my presentation, but there's no mention of a possible collaboration with training programs. So I'd love to hear from the audience or others here at NSGC for further clarification in case these are the intentions of the NSGC, but they were just not written. I think that the key take-home message of the results, though, is to this question is that although training programs might be looked at as the leaders on this issue, that the emphasis really is on collaboration and support from ancillary groups with broad reach and influence. So just as NAPD beautifully said, no study is without limitations. This study was limited in sample size, and the self-reported minority sample was even smaller. And we did not make participants report their minority status. We allowed them to. And I know, like, one participant in particular said, I'm a white female, but I'm in an interracial relationship, and so I am a minority in the genetic counseling field. So we need to take whatever data we got from minorities in this study with a grain of salt. Program affiliation was not recorded to protect anonymity, so it was unclear how many programs were represented in this survey or how many participants came from each program. And as mentioned earlier, the response rate couldn't be calculated, and future studies looking at program admissions teams should rethink the sampling method. My conclusions, as genetic counseling training programs evolve, we must consider the substantial lack of parity of the profession with the populations we serve. Our findings suggest a considerable awareness of this need, though an overemphasis on financial strategies that shifts the focus away from higher impact, low cost approaches such as mentorship, educational outreach, and targeted recruitment strategies. Also, this should be a collaborative effort, and it should not fall on the shoulders of just one group. Lastly, unless diversity is made a priority, genetic counseling will remain one of the least inclusive allied health professions. My acknowledgements, I want to thank Gayun Chan-Smutko, who's the PI for my project, Dita Obler, Ilana Mittman, who were on my committee. They are all three of them are integral figures in our campaign for diversity in genetic counseling. Margarita, the statistician at Brandeis, and I didn't write it, but thank you, Brandeis University, for training me and for letting me be here. So these are my references and photo credits, and thank you.